Well, thank you both for having me. This is really exciting. Happy to share some strategies and tactics for everyone today that should help with early stage growth, especially companies that are on the earlier side, working with maybe a tighter budget and wondering what they should do with their budget or with their time to grow the companies. So as Alok mentioned, Mattermade, we are a growth strategy and execution firm specifically for B2B companies. Our clients have ranged from Dropbox to HelpShift to a bunch of others. And basically our model is that rather than having an in-house marketing team, we actually have a 10-person marketing team that can spin up in a day and then help your company grow for 6 months. So enough about us. I really want to spend this time talking about marketing with everybody and growth. So the first section of this, we're going to go through some foundational work. The most important piece, I think, to start with is around goal setting, because when you typically think about goals, many times we come into organizations and the goals are set almost as arbitrary numbers. So, whether it's a CEO or sometimes a VC will say, you really need to be hitting a certain lead commit goal. Usually it's not the VCs anymore. Usually it's kind of founders who have maybe read some stuff that's outdated. And so one of the things that's important to know is that you should align your sales and marketing teams by not having a lead commit goal and instead having a shared revenue goal. So that's kind of the first myth that I like to debunk, which is don't have lead commit goals, have revenue goals that are shared across different teams so everyone is aligned. The next one is around, okay, well then how do we figure out what is reasonable as a goal? And the best way to solve for this, we found, is to test and back your way into those numbers. So one of the things that we like to do really early on is come in and test all the different channels that we believe we have a hypothesis around will be a high producing channel for us, and then figure out what the cost to acquire is in that channel. And then based on the cost to acquire that we establish, we can begin to reverse engineer what would be reasonable for those revenue goals. And by reasonable, I mean, what would it actually cost to acquire? If we find that it takes $100 in LinkedIn to generate a viable conversation with someone in our ICP, our ideal customer profile, and then 23% of those conversations convert to sales, bam, now we have something that we can turn into a spreadsheet, into a model, and establish some realistic revenue goals. Another thing that's important here on the growth is not to ignore market sizing. I can't tell you how many times we've worked with organizations where CEO will come in and say, here's our audacious goal, which is fantastic. We should all have audacious goals, but it's important to be realistic about how many ideal customers actually exist in your world. This is many times referred to as TAM, but a lot of the time the TAM, total addressable market, is kind of the total addressable market for the long-term vision of the company rather than the now-term vision of the company. And so it's important for the early executive teams and co-founding teams to look at, based on the product we have today and in the next 6 months, who can we actually go sell to? And that's going to be a very different number than the TAM that you likely were pitching to your investors. So that's another piece to be really, really focused on. And then the last one here is just to use those two kind of knobs, if you will, the TAM of now, right? Your real universe today, and some channel testing, put those together in a spreadsheet, and you can very quickly establish some realistic goals for you and your team to sprint towards. So that is this first slide. Next, MarTech. This comes up a lot because it's hard to determine, where should we spend our money? What's worth investing in the early stages? And so this chart that we've put together here represents, where to spend your money if you're on a lean budget. And then let's say you just raised a Series A or something like that, or a really big seed. What would look to spend your money on in that case? I'll speak to the lean budget because I think we're mostly talking earliest stage here today, but I'm happy to answer questions down the road about the later stage budget. So one of the most important things before you stack any technology is to make sure your list is high quality, right? If you aren't working from a high quality list with accurate, target companies, good email addresses, good titles that's up to date, then all of the other stuff is just going to be wasted effort. So the first thing is to really make sure that you've spent time with the list, make sure that's well enriched. You're not getting a bunch of bounces. A lot of stuff goes into that. Happy to answer questions later. Then the next step, you have your list, is, how are you going to orchestrate some form of marketing automation, some form of cadence out to this list. So we recommend tools like HubSpot. That's our favorite for overall versatility. Then, of course, once you have a sales team, you're going to need something like Salesforce. Once you have a website with some meaningful traffic, you're going to need some sort of intelligence tool like Leadfeeder, which will tell you of those companies that you're trying to target, who's actually visited your website. Who's visited your pricing page, which is a great indicator for some level of sales readiness. And then some free tools like Google Optimize and Google Analytics to understand how visitors are moving through your buyer journey, through your funnel. So that's the lean stack. And of course, within that, this isn't written in stone. There are other versions of this that can be really helpful. For example, if you're on an even more lean budget, you could use a company like Autopilot instead of HubSpot, which is materially less than HubSpot. You could use all sorts of different free CRMs instead of Salesforce, just to get yourself off the ground. These are, you should be generating revenue before you buy a HubSpot license or Salesforce license. But the one thing I will caution is we do work with a lot of companies who cling on to those free tools for a really long time. And then they go through a very painful process of ripping them out and getting up to speed with best practices a little bit later than they probably should have. So once you do start to see some repeatable sales velocity, I highly recommend getting the most basic Salesforce license and transitioning your team over to that and some kind of core best practices, so that you don't have to slow way down when you think it's time to speed way up, just because you have to transition systems. So that is on the MarTech stack. And then the last part of this first section is talking about, what are the best growth opportunities that you don't have to spend money on. And this is one that I'm really passionate about, because we see this. I always like to speak about, what is the mistake that companies are making, and how can we learn from that and help people avoid making that mistake. And the mistake that we see all the time is companies build their MVP, they get really excited, and then they're like, great, we need to start creating ads, and we need to start spending money to get customers. And that isn't the right next step. The right next step is to spend time talking to prospects and potential customers and really making sure that your message is aligned with the persona that's going to buy. And a lot of the time that takes some time to dial in. Companies will think that their persona is, a director of IT, but then they may learn over enough conversations that there's actually a buying committee. It's not just the director of IT. You need influence from a senior engineer, and then you need approval from the CEO, and you need, and the director of IT turns out to be your champion, but not your buyer. And so that's just a simple example of when you have enough conversations with the prospects that you're going to be selling to, you can begin to see these patterns and understand more about that buying landscape, so that you can then tailor your message. Because in that example, the messaging that you would want and the selling material that you would want to put in front of the director of IT as your champion is completely different than the material that you would want them to put in front of their CEO as the decision maker, and completely different than the material that you'd want them to put in front of the director or the engineering manager who needs to, be into the product and use the product at a hands-on level. So before you begin deploying budget and then determining that, the budget isn't effective in this channel, take the time to have those customer conversations and really hone in on those buyer personas and the buying committee. So that's in a sense a free growth opportunity. Doesn't cost you any money, just a little bit of time, and it'll be really worth the effort in the long run. The next free growth opportunity that we see kind of squandered a lot is the handoff between marketing and sales. So a lot of the time, early stage companies, they'll all focus on acquisition, and then a lead comes in, and then everybody's like, great. And there's a scramble to, what do we do with it now? And then it's kind of, the easiest way to describe this would be everybody just wings it. And this should be a process. Selling should be a process. And so the handoff should also be a process so that leads don't drop through the cracks. And as a company scales, this is one of the most common places where revenue is lost, because good leads will come in. There won't be a clear handoff with sales. There won't be a clear qualification process. And then that person goes cold and buys from your competitor. So that's another place where if you just spend a little bit of time determining what your SLA is with sales or with SDR team, and even if you don't have those, even if it's just a CEO and some co-founders, you should still have an SLA between each other of like, what happens when we do get a hot lead? How are we going to handle that? What questions are we going to ask them? And what are their next steps that we're driving towards? The next one is around customer storytelling. So again, customer storytelling doesn't cost you any money. And at the end of the day, this is going to be better than any kind of demand generation you can do. And ultimately it will feed demand generation. So when you have a couple of customers, even one, spend time with them, record the conversations, make them a champion such that you can use their quotes, such that they will leave you reviews. Them getting on LinkedIn and talking, or Twitter, and talking about how great your product is the best marketing that could ever happen. And that'll go much further than paid. And then you can take that endorsement and put paid budget behind it so that more people see it. So if you were to focus in one place, once you've nailed your personas, really focus on customer storytelling, because it is free. And the final place here that again is high leverage growth opportunity, doesn't cost any money, is customer reviews. So as you rack up a couple of your first customers, get them out into Capterra and G2 leaving reviews. And an easy way to do this a lot of the time is to write the review for them. So these companies are busy, your buyers are busy. So have enough conversations to know what value they're getting out of the tool, write the review for them, send it to them and say, does this review sound reasonable? Does this sound like something you'd be comfortable saying about us? And if so, would you be willing to share it on Capterra or G2? And that is a great way to control what nuances someone is sharing about the product that will help you sell. And B, it makes it easy for them to be a champion, because they might be willing, but they also might not be willing to sit down, use their brain, and write 2 paragraphs about you. So it helps grease those skids. So that is the end of part 1. I will hand it back over to Alok for any questions.
Thanks, Eli. This was great. There was one question in the chat room which was asking about, are these tools specific to, let's say, the US market, or is it sort of universal across other markets? Any quick thoughts there? The MarTech stack and others. Yeah, sorry.
Absolutely. All of those tools should be globally relevant. So they should absolutely work anywhere.
Okay. And one question, this is from my side. Where do you see tools like Drift and others, especially on the B2B side? I know Drift is more B2C, but where do you see tools similar to Drift in the MarTech stack for an early stage company? Do you see them to be of any value, or do you think there aren't enough leads coming down the pike? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think at the earliest stages, the traffic is too low for that investment to make sense. And I don't just mean investment from a monetary sense. I think that that's something that everyone scrambles to do because they see it on all of the big company websites. But my honest opinion, that it frequently differs from popular opinion, is that's kind of a distraction when they should be focused on very high effort manual conversations with prospects in the early stage to learn the most. And then once your web traffic gets up to a certain point where people genuinely would be coming to the site on a regular basis, having questions that may not be answered by the site, and you want to capture their information and be able to start a conversation. But to me, that's like after a Series A, closer to a Series B, when your web traffic becomes meaningful.
Fantastic. That's very good. There's one more question. Okay, so what are some of the software aggregator platforms specifically for North America around software advice? So I think you mentioned Capterra and G2. Are there any others that sort of bubble up, in your opinion, to the top?
Capterra and G2 are definitely the I think most relevant in B2B. There are
Mm-hmm.
certainly other sites in that ecosystem that exist, and each one has a little bit different of a focus. Some of them skew more SMB, some
Mm-hmm.
of them skew more enterprise, but
Mm-hmm.
um, generally speaking, I would start with those two because I think they're the most commonly referenced and high trafficked, and
Mm-hmm.
they are seemingly beginning to take some of the clout of, whereas Gartner and
Mm-hmm.
Forrester, they still have clout in enterprise for sure. But I think more and more the G2s and the Capterras of the world are beginning to replace that in some sense as the new school authority. I don't think that they can compete head to head yet, but I would certainly make that investment so that by the time they're taken with equal weight, you have some level of established authority on those platforms.
Got it. Got it. So you're saying even when you have, let's say, one or two sort of reviews, it's still worthwhile to sort of double down on them and sort of put some small budget and see how you can amplify that.
100%. Yeah. And that's so another quick tidbit there that I think a lot of people don't realize is when you go to those sites, not all of them, but some of the big ones, usually the first half of the page is all paid, and they don't make that clear to the buyers. And so even if you have one or two reviews, you can buy your way to the top of that first page. And I would never try for the top. It's not worth the investment, but even just getting into that first page, because people who are looking at reviews on a Capterra or G2 are already in a buying process, right? They have raised their hand and they said, I am looking for this type of software and I'm likely going to make a purchase. So it's an extremely high intent, much more so than LinkedIn, much more so than, I would say much more so than even some Google search terms. So that's usually one of the first places we like to deploy budget because it is so high intent.
Got it. Fantastic. One other question for me, because I know in the audience there are some founders who are like developer tools or data science tools kind of company.
Yes.
Any thoughts on sort of where to find audiences for them? I know there's review sites like Stack Overflow and others, but any insights around marketing for those kinds of folks? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for a technical and developer based audience, I think the question is what is it that you can do for the community? Because there's such a tight knit community, is there something you can offer? It could range from valuable to funny to controversial, but something that you could put out into the community in an organic way that generates conversation that your company happens to either be facilitating or be a part of. And so that, I think, for the developer community is usually one of the best ways in the early stage to get your message out there without having to brute force spend a ton of money, because also that developer audience, especially at a senior level, is extremely hard to get reliable FaceTime with through paid channels. So
Right. Got it. There was one other question. I'm just going to read it out because I don't fully understand it. What are the recommendations to target growth in Europe or US for a B2B deep tech industrial startup? So maybe it's a question more around if it's like an industrial IoT or like focusing more on sort of industrial software rather than more sort of so more around sort of traditional businesses. Any thoughts there?
It's hard to answer that question with accuracy without knowing more about your actual ICP and buyer personas, which we obviously don't have time to go into on today's call. But I will say some of those more traditional industries, almost all of them will have associations. And so when we are trying to get in front of a more traditional industry, the first place we look is, any industry, but specifically niche industries, where do those professionals go for their information? They're not hanging out on LinkedIn if they're kind of old school enough. They're probably members of the National Association of Plumbers or whatever, like that's a silly example, but they're probably members of some sort of association, and that would be the place to start. Many of those will allow you to sponsor events or come to trade shows, or it's going to be a much more old school process with that audience. So play that game, be the really helpful tech enabler in that niche old school community, but go through their channels. Don't try to force new channels on them, because that's not where they're spending their time.
Got it. We have more questions streaming in. So this is Binny Matthews. He's asking for a developer tool business where go-to-market is bottoms up, B2C, a B2 developer, and then you're trying to sell top down, right? So any thoughts, qualitative or quantitative, on how long does one focus on the B2C before starting to sell from the top? So basically,
Sure.
There's two motions. You're trying to do bottoms up adoption, but then at some point you have to sell top down. So any quantitative or qualitative thoughts on that? Yeah.
I think, so the first question would be, have you clearly identified the top down business case? A, and then B, if you put so this is always really hard for early stage teams to do, especially technical early stage teams. But like, if you put your really objective business hat on, can you see that use case being played out bottoms up already? Meaning, if, let's say that you have a tool that's used by 5 engineers within the company that you're thinking of selling top down to, is the whatever the 5 engineers are doing, and this would be completely different for every tool, but whatever that top down sale is supposed to be, whether it's a consolidation play, a security play, like get access to reports and see what those people are doing play. I mean, there's so many different top down sales models that you could be chasing down, but like, do you have critical mass in the organization to truly make that sale? Because you're going to waste a lot of your time and a lot of that manager's time if you try to go top down before there's truly a compelling reason to. And so I would say, don't be aspirational when you're thinking about that. Be really honest with yourself about, if I was that manager, would this really truly be delivering some sort of kernel of value that I can't live without? And that should be your guidepost until this is something like, oh, wow, they won't be able to go back to the way they did it before unless they have this. Then you probably don't have enough bottoms up adoption yet for that, or you haven't clearly identified the top down sale yet or offer.
Got it. Great. Now let's switch gears and maybe you can start the second section, and we'll come back to folks. Keep your questions coming. We'll come back to your questions once we finish the second section.
Perfect. All right. Thanks for all the questions, everybody. Now we're going to talk about some marketing. These are kind of marketing fundamentals around messaging and positioning. So, and just how to think about marketing in general. Because it's funny how frequently we realize that everyone has a little bit of a different definition of what marketing should do. So we like to break this down into a really simple way to think about marketing. There are 4 steps. The first one is that you need to build awareness and trust. The second is that you need to map your product to your customers' problems through lifecycle marketing. Then you need to turn your customers into champions through social proof selling. And then you need to enable sales discussions through materials and the way that you message and position your product, and then facilitate a seamless handoff. And if your marketing team, whether that's you as the CEO or co-founder or a small group of co-founders, if you do those 4 things, you will be getting it right. You'll be on the right path. The reason why these sound obvious, the reason why we spell these out is I can't tell you how many times a company, early stage company, focuses on building the product. They get their MVP, they buy a list, and then they just start direct messaging this list through email. And then maybe they get some positive signal. Maybe they get a couple of prospects out of a 10,000 person list or something like that, or 1,000 person list. And they're like, well, we'll get better at marketing, but we got some interest. So this is the right thing. What you're doing is you're burning that list. You're lighting it on fire and throwing it in the trash can, because you only have a couple of shots at reaching the people who could ultimately buy from you. And you don't want to be the door-to-door salesman, right? Sending an email to a cold list who's never heard of your brand, who's never heard of your product, who hasn't heard, about how effective it could be from a friend, these kinds of things, is like ringing up their doorbell and trying to sell them a vacuum on their front porch, right? And they've never met you. They're like, why are you selling me a vacuum? I don't even need a vacuum. I was actually, making dinner. You're interrupting me. Like, you don't want to be that type of company. Even if you can get a couple of early hits out of it, long-term, you'll be hurting yourself. And so that's why remembering that the first step is getting out into the community, finding ways to add value to that community and begin to introduce your brand to that community so they can become adjacently aware of it in non-sales environment. And then you begin to, step 2, map your product to their problems through lifecycle marketing. So it's a much more smooth, natural process if you follow these steps. So that's why I put these up here. It's just something to think through as a litmus test for approaching these in the early stages. All right, so now product marketing and how can we lever that to close more deals. So this is really important, especially if you are a technical founding team. And this one is like, it sounds brutal, but I'm just going to say it because it's so important to hear. No one cares about your product. They don't care about your product. Even if they love your product, like even companies, they don't actually care about your product. They care about their problems and getting them solved. And so this is usually a controversial message for technical founders to hear, but it is so vital when you're actually trying to sell the product and get out into the market to remember that. Because if you internalize that and then think, oh, yes, we have a product, but really our goal is to solve our prospects' problems, your go-to-market and your ramp up to growth is going to be so much faster than the company that's in love with their own product and frustrated that people won't buy it. And so aligning yourself with the problems that someone has and really empathizing with that and deeply understanding it, and then being able to map your product, and even if that means some changes, mapping your product to solving those problems. That is how you'll get customers that are champions of the company, right? Not because of the product, but because the company is focused on solving their problems and the product happens to do that. So that's just really, really critical to think through it, and almost like a mantra to repeat, right? If you wake up every morning and you're building product, just remember this needs to solve their problems, not just be this glorious piece of product that won't end up getting used. And so part of that is remembering to get your persona development right. We talked about that in an earlier slide. And knowing that that's different than your ideal company profile, right? So the last piece on this slide is once you have those two things going, it should be very easy to define what the use cases are for your product. When you don't have this right, you're going to be writing your website, writing your copy, and it won't come intuitively to create how to use this product if you are the engineering manager at the company and how it's valuable for this person. And then how to use this product if you're the CIO of this company and how it's valuable for this person. And so that's a good litmus test. Once you really are out solving problems and have that mindset, you could write those sections on your website in an afternoon without much effort because you'll be already so obsessed and focused on those use cases and problem solving. And I'd say if you can't do that today, no problem. Just take a step back, go do some development with your prospects, have some customer interviews, really understand what problems they have and how they like to solve them. And then you can begin to kind of course correct and get closer to this path. All right. So I talked earlier about the when leads go into the kind of the gap between marketing and sales. And this is important to talk about, not necessarily for early stage, but it's important for early stage people to be thinking about, because one of the early stumblings that companies, let's call it like Series A and Series B, end up having a lot of the time is that marketing and sales end up becoming at odds. They're not friends anymore. And this could kill millions of dollars in capital raised if you don't get ahead of it and correct it before it becomes a problem. Because what happens when marketing and sales aren't friends anymore, it's usually the two leaders, the sales leader and the marketing leader, don't agree on things. And they start kind of just operating in a siloed environment, which an early stage company can't afford to do. Then marketing starts generating leads that sales doesn't want to deal with. Sales goes rogue, starts doing their own outbound. And before you know it, you've wasted 6 to 12 months. And you can extrapolate out how much money you've wasted based on how large your team is and what the burn is. But then, you as the CEO are catching heat or maybe get fired by the board because you didn't properly manage this. So this is easy to fix if you do it before it's even a problem. And sometimes if you do it before you even have two distinct marketing and sales leaders, because it's almost it's a cultural thing, and then it's a tactical thing. So these two things I'll speak to. On the cultural level, if you have sales and marketing set different goals at the highest level, they will drift apart because their incentives aren't aligned. And so this is why, like we speak about, MQLs and SQLs and lead commits as being an old school type of thinking, because none of that matters if it doesn't convert to sales. And sales, they're judged by exactly that latter statement. They don't care if they don't make revenue because they're comped on a variable comp structure, and they're not going to get paid, and then they're going to get fired if the deals don't close. So marketing needs to be aligned with this. Otherwise, they're going to be getting a gold star for a bunch of leads that didn't matter. And then sales is going to be pissed. And that's where the line in the sand gets created and people start drifting apart. So set sales and marketing goals with those leaders in the same room together. Have them agree on what those goals should be. So, and same goes for budget. Have the budget be created in the same room with those two leaders. And initially, that may be the same person, sales and marketing. But as you scale up, you'll need to have leaders that are dedicated to each of those distinct skills. Have them create a win together, lose together culture and mindset between those two groups. The other piece of that is firmographics and personas. So this goes without saying, and this should be company-wide. This isn't just sales and marketing. This is sales, marketing, and product, right? And customer success. Everyone needs to agree on what we're building and who we're building it for. Because if product thinks that they're building for a certain persona, and marketing and sales believe they're selling to and marketing to a different persona, naturally, this is not going to be a great fit. Naturally, there's going to be friction. And that friction doesn't need to actually exist within the organization if those three groups get together and are always in alignment with, who are the personas that we're going after? At what type of companies? How would you describe the companies? What do these personas care about? Like, what is keeping them up at night? Why are they working late and not eating dinner with their family? If you can solve those problems, if you're aligned to problems that help them not have to work late, that help them be able to spend time with their kids, like those are the products that fly off the shelf because you're truly aligned with a pain in their life. And so keeping the company aligned with that and clear is essential. I like to say the CEO should be able to wander around. This is not my words, this is someone else. But the CEO should be able to wander around the company and ask every single person from an intern all the way through to their senior leadership, who are we selling to? What are their pains? And everyone should have the same answer. And if they don't, then you as the leadership team have work to do, right? That should be very clear. And then some tactical things like having weekly lead quality reviews between the SDR and sales leadership and marketing, right? Looking at the leads that are actually coming in and saying, is this the right stuff? What are the SDRs learning in their conversations with those leads that we could then, are some of these leads good, but they're really not understanding a certain feature? Well, great. That's good feedback for marketing. They can then bolster that feature ahead of time so that it accelerates sales cycles. And then simple things like setting up a Zap using Zapier, so that whenever a lead comes in, everyone in the whole company gets a notification and can celebrate that. right? And can be aware of it. And then they can be curious and ask, hey, why didn't that lead close, right? That's a good question to ask. That's not a nitpicking question. That's how can we learn from this in the early stages? And of course, as the company grows, you can't continue that. It'll end up in some sort of marketing and sales specific channel. But in the early days, I think it's really good to have that be front and center because that's ultimately what everyone's driving towards. All right.
Awesome. This is fantastic, Eli. One question that I always sort of thought about, right? In the early stages, entrepreneurs also have to decide between sort of the sales motion, whether it is inside sales versus sort of more sort of field versus, I don't know, combination. And sometimes it's also, I've heard terms like marketing-led sales, right? Any thoughts on how should founders think about that? About inside sales versus sort of field sales versus marketing-led sales.
Yeah, I think it really depends on the industry and the product and the buyer persona. Some industries are going to be much more old school, much more, open to field sales. And that's going to be, especially when you get into larger, ASPs, as the deal size goes up and your average selling price goes up, the need for something like field sales is going to also go up. And the same could be said for inside sales, right? If you're selling to SMBs, doesn't make sense to have inside sales unless your deal size is large, but most likely it won't be. And then most likely marketing-led sales makes sense because it's more of an inbound motion, more of a self-service motion. So I'd say the easiest kind of squint your eyes, broad strokes way to think about it is what is your ASP? That's going to determine what type of sales model you have.
Yep. And should marketing, let's say I'm the founder, and I'm just trying to hire a by the way, the first question a lot of people have is, should I hire a sales leader first or should I hire a marketing leader first? And sort of a corollary to that question is, should a marketing leader also have some sales quota? Any thoughts on those two? Yeah.
Great questions. I think pretty universally, if you're, again, it'll depend on your ASP, right? So, but I would say pretty universally, you should hire the sales leader first. I think there are enough early wins that can come from some fairly simple marketing strategies and tactics that are very well known on the internet, and just even the things we're talking about today that an early smart team, whether they're in product or engineering, could do just to get the basic setup that would give a sales leader enough demand to prove viability, right? And also in the early stages, you shouldn't rely on, unless you're truly fully inbound self-service, you shouldn't rely on marketing for those first 10 deals at all, right? You should be outbound, reaching out. It should be a sales motion. And then once you've proved viability, then bring in marketing to begin establishing that demand gen engine. And so 100%, I would say sales leadership should come first. And initially that'll be the CEO, right? The CEO is the first sales leader. Then they bring in a real sales leader. Then that sales leader, usually the marketing leadership should come in around the same time the sales leader and the board agree that there is repeatability. And they have budget now to begin scaling out their team of inside sales reps. That's the point where you don't want to wait. You don't want to hire those inside sales reps and then build marketing, because what will happen is those reps will not have enough lead flow on their own. And then they'll get frustrated. They won't hit their quotas. So that's kind of how we think about that.
Great. I have a couple of questions here in the chat. One is, do you see some paradigm shifts in marketing post-COVID, especially when customers are reluctant to adopt digital solutions?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a hard question. And I think it keeps changing, which is almost feels like a cop-out answer. But initially there was a bunch of opportunity because everyone froze their budgets. And so the ability to go buy ad placements across all the channels just went from really expensive to really affordable. That's changed. So then the budgets kind of began thawing. Everybody realized that there's this opportunity to be louder than their competitors who are afraid to spend money. And now, now the cost is way up because everybody has realized, well, we still need to grow our business. And if we don't, our competitors are going to take that opportunity. And we also have this field marketing budget that, we were going to go sponsor these events and we were going to be out in the field. And instead now they're taking that and spending it digitally. So I'd say that opportunity has come and gone. I think now is a great opportunity for companies to get more creative with their marketing, right? There's this really fine line that needs to be towed between being obnoxious with like too many webinars and too many, like people just want to take a break from their screen. But there is this opportunity that nobody's commuting, right? Or very few people are commuting, and people they have the time to consume more information. So if you can find a way through marketing to get creative and be a source of that information in their extra time, I think that's the new opportunity that has been created.
Sounds good. We have a few more questions, but let's take it towards the end. I know you have a few more slides to go over, so let's finish the slides, and then time permitting, we can take a few more questions. Yep.
All right, perfect. Let's get on to lean demand gen. Okay. So this is a question we get a lot, which is, when we're in the earliest stages, does it make sense? ABM, account-based marketing, is this term that gets thrown around a lot. Folks who are newer to the startup world hear it and think it's the new hotness. And in reality, it's been around for a very long time, but it has been making a big comeback. So does it make sense as an early stage team to take this approach? The shortcut to the answer is absolutely yes. The reason for that is that in the earliest stages, you don't have a big budget. And it's important to focus that budget on only the accounts that are going to move the needle for you. And so in account-based marketing, you're defining those accounts, and you're saying, these are the only, if we were to succeed in blowing out our number for the year and being wildly successful, these are the companies who we would close. And then only focusing your marketing activities around getting in front of those folks. So it allows you to be really focused instead of like the shotgun approach. It can be much more personalized. So that is the quick answer to whether or not you should take an account-based marketing approach. In the COVID economy, we just spoke about this. So the one thing I didn't mention specific to now that is pretty obvious but worth saying is your buyers have switched from, we're trying to grow at all costs and like give us all the tools that'll give us a 1% increase in upside, to a really thoughtful essentials mindset, right? Everybody wants to grow still, but everybody doesn't want to go out of business. And so you need to, if your product is not yet essential, you won't get bought. So I would spend a lot of time figuring out then, in that case, what is it that would make our product essential? How do we position ourselves for, and some companies naturally get to take advantage of this, right? Like one of our clients, they have a point of sale booking system for SMBs. And you would think like, whoa, they're just getting totally annihilated right now because all of these SMBs are closing their doors. And they are, if anybody's not got the budget now, it's these companies that people can't physically go to their locations. But instead, they reposition themselves as, we are the solution that will help you safely reopen, that will help you process touchless payments, that will allow you to book appointments online. Like these, so they went from being a nice to have pre-COVID, let's modernize your tech stack pre-COVID for businesses that didn't get it and didn't necessarily want to essential. You want to stay open, you want to not close your business, you have to use us, right? This is the only option. And they're flying off the shelf. So I'd say maybe your business is less obvious for how that repositioning works, but it's worth taking the time and asking yourself, can we reposition as an essential service? So that last section was pretty short.
Great. I have one question here in the chat, which was sort of pertaining to part 2, but I think let's still take it. Are there any proven success stories where there is a unified sales and marketing structure? So in other words, a single revenue structure at the top. Any examples of that you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot, but it never stays that way. So the easy way to illustrate this is Chief Revenue Officer or VP of Revenue, right? This is a newer title that's really become very popular, and I think is quickly becoming kind of the standard best practice in B2B organizations. And it's exactly that. Is, if at the end of the day, the final say comes to a leader who owns both sales and marketing, they can end any kind of disagreements really quickly, because they care about revenue at the highest level, and they don't care about sales or marketing. And the funny thing though is that once the business scales, that person then hires a VP of marketing and they hire a VP of sales. So it ends up being basically that you have a CEO that's just dedicated to revenue, and they don't have to think about product, and kind of goes back to the old way of thinking. But I do really believe in that. I think that that's a great way to go. And I found that the organizations we work with that have a chief revenue officer or a VP of revenue then we're working with this person instead of a VP of marketing or a VP of sales, are just that they move faster, because there's less ego involved in each side. And it's just about, how do we win? That's it. I think that is the new kind of best practice.
Got it. One other question that came into the chat was, what are the benefits of product demos as part of the sales process? Any quick thoughts on that? I
mean, it's hard to answer because it's a pretty broad question. Product demos are super essential in the sense that someone needs to understand and envision how that product is going to work in general, B, how it's going to work for them, and C, it's an indication of some form of sales readiness if someone's willing to sit through a product demo or raise their hand and ask for one. So I'd say those are probably the 3 major benefits of a product demo.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Folks, we have another few minutes before we wrap up. So any last thoughts? Any questions from anybody else? No. Radesh, any questions from you or any other?
Yeah, so I think one question I would like to ask is from startups especially, who are, and this is post-COVID and coming from different geographies other than the US. Is there anything specific that they have to now look into? You covered quite a few points, but is there anything that becomes more relevant right now than what it was pre-COVID?
On the marketing side of things?
Yeah.
Marketing. I really think it's that the positioning is rethinking your positioning and how you can become positioned as essential and not like a nice to have, or not like a nice efficiency for your team. That sales cycle will just be a nightmare. So, even if it's just spin, you need to find a way to spin what you have into something that they cannot live without. It's kind of the age-old startup, are you a vitamin or are you a painkiller? I think now that is just intensified to like, are you a life-saving painkiller? Like, are you something that someone has to swallow, otherwise they will die, their business will die? And if you're not, sit down and really figure out how you can reposition yourself to be that. And that doesn't, I know that that's daunting because I've been a founder myself, and that's hard to do sometimes depending on what your product is. So it doesn't have to be a life-saving painkiller for the company. it could be a life-saving painkiller for a person in the company, right? It could be that your thing for the director of IT means that they won't lose their job. And to them, that's life-saving. It doesn't have to be company-wide. Of course, the more broadly applicable it is in that sense, the more potent and fast your sales cycles will be and your ability to market will be. But if you don't have that broad of appeal, like the example that I described with the company that helps these brick and mortars reopen, then just focus on one persona, focus on your buyer or your champion, and become absolutely essential for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, we have more questions streaming in. This one is a very specific, maybe So Shravan is asking for B2B startups coming from India, but selling in the US. Is a US-based sales leader a must-have? Any quick thoughts?
So the question is US-based sales leader.
Yeah, so somebody who has to be, sort of located physically in the US from a sales leadership. Is that like a requirement, or can they do sort of inside sales from elsewhere, but maybe marketing is here, or yeah.
It's a hard question to answer. I don't want to say yes, because I don't know that to be true necessarily. I think it will be easier if they're based here, because they're going to have to work. The good sales leaders that I know are working constantly, right? They're really getting in there and spending time with their customers on their own hours. And so it might be brutal if you have your sales leader that's basically needing to work US hours.
Makes sense.
So
Yep. No, that's good. Another question, this is around content marketing and channels. So for startups that are taking a bottom first community driven approach, video is a fast growing medium, sometimes driving higher traffic than search. Do you see similar trends in other startups?
Yeah, I mean, I think video is becoming much more pervasive in marketing. We're seeing a lot of that right now in LinkedIn as taking off, where people are live streaming, people are recording little short snippets, and it's kind of coming back to like social selling. Really, it's like the new way to social sell is to put yourself out there in this kind of honest and unedited way. It used to be that video was a medium that would go off to editors and be really polished and super professional and very curated. And the trend we're seeing now is that people want to see real people, and they don't want the edited down version. They want the 2 minutes of someone rambling and talking into their phone, just sharing it out. So at least as far as like social selling and the trends we're seeing with video there, that's kind of the lay of the land as we see it today.
Okay. This one is more generic. So this Maria is asking, what does, from your vantage point, Elias, what do you see as the biggest problem in B2B space, especially around industrial sectors? I guess they're asking more around sort of traditional businesses, right? Like manufacturing and things like that, right? Any opportunity that you see from your vantage point? Yeah.
I wish I could answer that question, but it's a little too broad for me to know where to take it.
Yep. Yeah, I think I think in general, some of the points you made around repositioning, so that you become sort of a real painkiller for somebody in the business. I think in the manufacturing, logistics, and a lot of those industrial sectors, that is happening, right? Because now supply chains are being reconstructed as we speak because of COVID, and if you can position yourself as a must-have in that, I think there's an opportunity there for sure. There's one. We'll take one last question. This is from Shobit. He's saying, are there any changes in demand gen plans for SaaS startups in mid-market versus enterprise? Any different tactics you would use for demand gen for mid-market versus enterprise SaaS?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to be totally different. I would say that with enterprise, you end up needing the investment in. Let me take a step back. In enterprise, you're going to have a buying committee. It's not just going to be a single decision maker. In mid-market, it's probably also going to be a buying committee, but maybe a less formal process. And so you need to be much more prepared for and just extremely clear on what that committee looks like, what each stakeholder needs. And have materials for each of those people, right? And so I think that the big shift in marketing is in making sure you're ready for that longer sales cycle, and you have a journey for those people on the committee to go through over the course of the selling process, so that you don't just tee sales up, and then they go into a 9-month sales cycle and it's crickets for them on the marketing and brand awareness front. So I'd say that's probably the biggest shift.
Yep, makes sense. I think we are just out of time. We have a couple minutes over. So thank you again. We had a fairly, engaged audience, between 35 to 40 people throughout the session. So thanks once again, Radhesh, for organizing it. Thanks, Elias, for making time. I know you're very busy, and if folks have specific questions, please do. We'll share Elias's email. You can reach out directly to him about specific questions and strategies that you may have, and he'll be more than happy to answer it. And any final thoughts, Elias?
No, thank you for everyone for joining. The questions were really great, and thank you both for having me.